IBO World Champion, La Bella Bestia, coming to you to show my appreciation for the ring IQ. So if you haven't already,
get guard, but
wow,
Howard,
look at the strength.
follow and subscribe Ring IQ and check out the relay where they cover today's top boxing news.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Bantamweight prospect Melissa Oddessa had this to say. She says, Serrano fights weaker, smaller opponents. 126-pound division, weak and dead. Yet instead of moving down or moving up, she fights smaller division opponents only. Did all 130-pound fighters in the division disappear? Cross-reference her and Mercado's record. Slick move by team, no threats accepted.
Melissa's a truth teller.
And perhaps that's why she's come under fire from none other than the GWOAT herself, Clarissa Shields.
The truth is often unpopular.
It can make you unpopular, but Melissa Oddessa, she tells no lies. I understand that Amanda Serrano wants to unify the featherweight division. I understand that they tried to get Erica Cruz in the ring, and it was Erica that walked away from the fight. I get all of that, but that doesn't change that she's fighting yet another super bantamweight after having already fought a super bantamweight in Daniela Bermudez. Daniela Bermudez, comparatively, was a more seasoned fighter, more seasoned champion than Jamie Mercado is.
We see what happened.
Daniela Bermudez was tough, holding her own against Amanda Serrano for a short while, till Body Shot folded her up like a beach chair.
Daniela's a more experienced fighter than Jamie.
Jamie, like Daniela Bermudez, is a champion at 122 pounds, but Jamie is younger than Daniela, far less experienced than Daniela, and she's even less cut out for this fight at 126 pounds than Daniela was.
They didn't land on Jamie by accident.
This is by design, and if you know anything about these fighters, anything at all, you'll see it too. You know, Jamie Mercado shows promise as a super bantamweight, but there's more work needs doing. And I knew that before this fight got made. You know, I saw the Alejandro Guzman fight. I saw the Riscon fight. I saw Jamie get hit a lot in those fights, and those fights took place at 122 pounds. This fight's taking place at 126. So what kind of odds can you really give Jamie against Amanda Serrano?
How much credit are you supposed to give Amanda?
If Amanda Serrano goes in there tomorrow night and smokes Jamie Mercado like a pack of cools, knocks her out on the undercard of Paul versus Woodley. It's funny how quickly Amanda Serrano's opinion has changed on these celebrity boxing matches, these YouTuber fights. You know, late last year, she was quoted as saying they need to stop this stupid celebrity boxing thing. Boxing is a serious game. Nothing to be doing for YouTube likes. Most amateurs turning pro fight 4 rounds. These guys are debuting in a 6-rounder. Someone's gonna get really hurt one day. Not cool at all. It's clear that late last year, Amanda Serrano was against these kinds of fights, whereas now what she's saying is, love them or hate them, they are my boys. Jake Paul, Logan Paul. We're riding this sport out together. Thankfully to them, Showtime Boxing and Stefan Espinoza for this opportunity.
Oh, she had to change her heart.
Yeah, as soon as it was convenient for her to do so. Listen, it's not Amanda Serrano's fault that Jelena Marjanovic didn't want to unify with her. And it's not Amanda's fault that Erica Cruz beat Jelena, and now Erica doesn't want to unify with her either, at least not for the time being. Erica turned down the fight. And who knows what Sarah Mahfoud is doing. I mean, none of that is Amanda Serrano's fault. It really isn't. But now what she's doing is sitting atop the featherweight division, perched, bringing up these smaller fighters. Smaller fighters like Daniela Bermudez, smaller fighters like Yamileth Mercado.
The casuals don't know this.
The casuals aren't familiar with these fighters. They're not familiar with Jamie Mercado. They're not familiar with Daniela Bermudez. And they're not familiar with the 2 journey women that Amanda Serrano fought the 2 fights before that. 2 fighters that, if it were someone else fighting them, someone like a Katie Taylor or an Ebony Bridges even, they'd face widespread criticism for fighting those kinds of opponents. You heard it right. I mean, Ebony Bridges, who has a grand total of what? 5 fights?
That time.
She fights Beck Connolly. You never hear the end of it.
People actually criticized her for fighting back.
But Amanda can fight 2 consecutive no-hopers with losses in the double digits coming right off of losses, and no one bats an eyelash. No one says a word. It's supposed to be okay when Amanda does it.
Before and after walking away from the Taylor fight.
You see, what makes Amanda Serrano such a frustrating fixture to some people is they know she's a talented fighter, they know she can box, and they know she can punch. But what makes her frustrating is doesn't seem like she really wants to test herself. Doesn't seem like she really wants to be in even matchups where, you know what, the other girl might give her a problem.
She's on easy street.
She's on an easier street than, say, Shannon Courtenay was when she fought Rachel Ball and Ebony Bridges. Comparatively, those were difficult fights for Shannon, more difficult than Amanda's fights have been for her. Amanda's definitely on an easier street than Katie Taylor was when she fought Delphine Persoon 2 times. That was yet another set of even matchups. That's the constant with Amanda. She's not in those kinds of even matchups.
She doesn't really want to be. That's why she walked away from the Taylor fight.
That's why she'd rather stay at featherweight than move up to super featherweight, which comparatively is a hotter weight class with better fighters and bigger names.
She wouldn't struggle to find fights up there.
And this is obvious to most anyone and everyone that's paying attention. Amanda only seems to want to fight in fights where the odds are pretty lopsided in her favor.
That's the constant.
It's not from a lack of opportunity. She was given a multi-fight deal by Matchroom. She's had opportunities. She was on the eve of what at that time would have been the biggest fight in women's boxing, and she chose to walk away from it.
Because these are the fights she really wants.
Kind of fights where she's not the one risking anything. You know, it's Daniela Bermudez moving up in weight and Jamie Mercado moving up in weight that are risking something.
No, Amanda Serrano was once a champion at 140 pounds.
That's before she even signed that multi-fight deal with Matchroom. Let's see her go up there and win a title from somebody now that that's a more densely populated weight class with better fighters. Better fighters like Mary McGee and Kaylee Reese and Chantel Cameron.
She held the title at 131.
Well, let's see her go up there and win one from somebody now that it's a more densely populated weight class with better fighters and that much more exposure. 130 pounds never got the press in the past that it's getting here today in 2021. Let's see Amanda go up there and really test her mettle. That's the problem. Most people know she's not going to do that.
She beats Jamie in one-sided fashion.
Like I'm expecting her to. That's nothing to shout from the rooftops about. It really isn't. Women's boxing is in a better place now than it's ever been, and there are that many more talented girls out there for Amanda to have super fights with. But these kinds of fights, these are the kind of fights she wants to have because she'd rather stay on easy street.
That's why Melissa Odessa's not off base.
She sees what the rest of us see. In other news, per tweet from Kevin Ioli, I'm sure that most of you have heard by now, the preliminary numbers for the Pacquiao vs. Ugas pay-per-view are something to the tune of 250,000 buys. A far more underwhelming number than I anticipated. I actually anticipated more.
Even with the withdrawal of Errol Spence Jr.
Nothing astronomical. Just around 300, maybe 350,000 buys. Kevin Ioli was asked by Joseph Rodriguez, in your estimation, what would the numbers have been had Spence not gotten hurt? I know Spence is a pay-per-view draw in theory, but not a big draw as of yet, to which Kevin Ioli replied, I would have guessed around 400 to 450,000. Boxing insider Rick Glacier says, with 250,000 pay-per-view buys, Ugas versus Pacquiao did as reported by Yahoo Sports, Kevin Ioli, and considering Pacquiao's rematch clause, if he decides to take the rematch, that means that'll be another huge financial bloodbath for Al Heyman. Heyman needs to hope Pacquiao retires.
Is this an indictment on Manny Pacquiao's marquee value?
It most certainly is. Manny just isn't the same draw that he used to be, and that's okay for a fighter who's in the twilight years of his career. I mean, this could very well be his final fight. So there's no harm in saying that Manny just ain't the draw that he used to be. It is an indictment on Manny Pacquiao's remaining marquee value, even under these circumstances where the guy he was supposed to fight pulled out 2 weeks out from the fight. I do think Kevin is right. I think the fight would have performed better on pay-per-view had Spence been able to compete. I think that would have certainly lended itself to the pay-per-view buys. It is an indictment on Manny's remaining marquee value, but it's not just an indictment on Manny, it's an indictment on the sport of boxing.
And the pay-per-view model.
There are those out there that would have you believe that pay-per-view is still the way to go, that there's all this hypothetical money left on the table for fighters who choose to go the other way, fighters who may be fighting on a streaming app as opposed to fighting by way of a conventional pay-per-view, the conventional pay-per-view model. Yet time and time again, what we're seeing, fight by fight, is that pay-per-view ain't what it used to be.
Not for Manny.
And not for boxing. And maybe it's because the sport of boxing isn't putting the right fights on pay-per-view, that in unison with the consumer's outcry, which is largely being ignored, that the average fight fan doesn't want to have to pay $80 every time two halfway decent fighters decide to have a fight.
Regardless of what their demands are.
I'll tell you something, you put a fight on pay-per-view, what you're essentially doing is relying on the fight fans to foot the bill. Foot the bill for the fighters and all the operational costs. That's what you're doing. You're relying on the fight fans to foot the bill. But the fight fans are the ones telling you they don't want to have to keep paying $80 just to see two halfway decent fighters have a fight.
And you're ignoring them.
You're not even taking stock of your consumer base and what your consumer base is telling you.
You're trying to convince us that all these different pay-per-views are pay-per-view worthy.
And what we're telling you is that they're not. These pay-per-views we've been seeing, they don't come nowhere near cracking 1 million or even 500,000. The only pay-per-view in recent memory that came close to cracking 1 million pay-per-view buys was pre-pandemic, involving Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury. And that pay-per-view was a box office flop. They lost money putting that thing on.
Don't take it from me. Take it from Bruce Trempler.
Top ranks Bruce Trempler. He would know, and that's the only pay-per-view in recent memory that came close to cracking 1 million pay-per-view buys. And even that pay-per-view, it didn't break even.
There's a lot that needs to change.
A whole lot. Because tomorrow night, a YouTuber and a retired mixed martial artist are set to have a pay-per-view of their own. And I've no doubts that that pay-per-view will outperform Pacquiao versus Ugas, Davis versus Barrios, Ruiz versus Areola,
Charlo versus Rosario.
Spence versus Garcia. You name it. I've no doubts that tomorrow's pay-per-view, or today's, depending on when this video is uploaded, that Paul versus Woodley fight, that pay-per-view, I think there's going to be a stark contrast between the numbers for that fight and the numbers for the aforementioned pay-per-views by way of the PBC.
A lot of boxers are about to get a reality check.
A reality check that they need to cash. A lot of boxers are set to get a reality check. A lot of boxers that got really big egos. They think they're stars already.
They've settled into their own mediocrity.
When a YouTuber and a retired mixed martial artist, a fight between them, when a fight like that draws more eyes and more attention and more pay-per-view buys than a championship boxing match, something really is wrong.
That draws more interest than a real fight.
Involving two real fighters. Yeah, something's wrong. And it ain't Jake Paul and Tyron Woodley that got the problem. They ain't got the problem. If Jake Paul wants to use the celebrity he's already amassed as a Disney kid and a social media influencer, that's his prerogative. There's not actually anything wrong with that. There is something wrong with is boxing's infrastructure.
All these prima donnas and all these peacocks.
Boxing needs to do better. It needs to get out of its own way, because when this kind of a circus fight, this kind of a spectacle, draws more eyes to the sport than your average run-of-the-mill championship boxing match. Oh, it's not the spectacle that's got the problem. The spectacle's probably going to make a killing. It's boxing that needs to change.
Boxing's got the problem.
All these different fucking fingers in a pie, all these fighters, all these managers, all these promoters, and you're telling me that boxing can't put together a fight that garners just as much interest, pay-per-view-wise, as this fucking circus fight?
Something's wrong.
Or is it that those kinds of fights that would have got that kind of attention, is it that those kinds of fights, they actually have been there, and you guys just didn't want to make them for whatever reason? Is it that you've been ignoring your consumer base for years, and now your consumers are ignoring you?
Your marination tactics have backfired.
We asked you for Joshua versus Wilder, we got Joshua versus Fury instead, 2 times. We asked you for Crawford versus Spence, we got Spence versus Garcia and Spence versus Porter.
And Spence versus the other Garcia.
There was a time when people wanted you to deliver them Gervonta Davis versus Vasyl Lomachenko. You ignored those people for years, quite content with Gervonta doing mediocre numbers against guys like lukewarm Leo and unknown Mario Barrios.
You ignored your consumer base, and now they're ignoring you.
They're probably going to stick Gervonta Davis in another pay-per-view this fall with Rolly Romero, regardless of which belt he decides to hang on to. In all likelihood, that's going to be his next fight.
That'll probably bring in another mediocre set of numbers.
Because boxing in America, emphasis on America, boxing in America has settled into its own mediocrity.
Thus, a lot needs to change.
Finally, I'm sure most of you have heard by now, per tweet from Mike Coppinger via his sources, Gervonta Davis has vacated his 130-pound title. WBA President Gilberto Mendoza tells ESPN he'll be granted permission to keep his 135 and 140-pound titles until his next fight. Within 48 hours of its conclusion, he'll relinquish one more belt. Roger Gutierrez and Chris Colbert were ordered to fight for the WBA's vacant title at 130 pounds. Will be only one champion in the division.
No surprises there.
I've been telling you guys since Gervonta Davis knocked out Leo Santa Cruz that I don't anticipate he's going to return to that weight class. I don't anticipate he's going to reign much longer as that division's full-fledged WBA champion because it's too much of a struggle for him to make the weight. And of course, the WBA is granting him leniency. They're allowing him to hold on to the Reggie belts he's got at 135 and 140 until his next fight, which is set to go down this fall. In all likelihood, it's going to be Rolly Romero. It's just a question of whether or not that fight will happen at 135 or 140 pounds, as either scenario is possible. It's possible that Rolly moves up in weight and fights Gervonta Davis for the Reggie belt he's got at 140 pounds, because strategically, that's the belt you might actually want to hang on to.
All those guys at 135 are going to end up at 140 anyway.
Teofimo Lopez, Devin Haney, Ryan Garcia, those guys ain't going to stay at lightweight forever. And if you want to get the drop on those guys, what you do is you hang on to that Reggie belt at 140 pounds before those guys move up, so that if you do, maybe you get elevated to full champion status once Josh Taylor moves up in weight.
After the Catterall fight.
And the only hiccup there, the only potential hiccup, is that Josh Taylor moving up to welterweight, that might be contingent upon a Terrence Crawford fight happening. Therein lies a dilemma. We don't know how much longer Terrence Crawford is going to be with Top Rank. But if he's not with them anymore, it's conceivable that may change the trajectory of Josh Taylor's career. Maybe he decides he don't want to move up in weight straight away because they ain't got a champion for him to fight at welterweight.
Which point he might stay at 140.
And if he stays at 140, continues to reign as that division's undisputed champion, guess what?
What?
Gervonta Davis don't get elevated to full WBA champion. He'll have to go through Josh in order to achieve that championship status. If it comes to that, I think Gervonta Davis will scrap that Reggie belt in a heartbeat, regardless of what the WBA orders.
If they gotta chuck it, they'll chuck it.
Why do I feel that way, you ask? Because of what Floyd Mayweather Jr. said post-fight after Gervonta Davis knocked out Mario Barrios. He said in plain English, they are keeping everything in-house.
Josh Taylor's not an in-house fighter.
He's not with the TMT. He's with Top Rank. Not holding my breath to see a fight like that because Floyd Mayweather Jr. in so many words told us not to. What happens with Gervonta Davis beyond potential Rolly Romero fight? Well, your guess is as good as mine. I don't know what they're going to do with this kid. I don't care either. As long as he's not holding any belts hostage, it's no sweat off my back.
And that's the saving grace.
The PBC ain't got no belts between 135 and 140 for him to fight for him to hold hostage. So if he wants to call himself a champion, if he wants a title, and he wants a belt, he's going to have to go through someone to get it.
Late time's over.